The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough to silence an entire room. The crystal chandelier above flickered slightly, catching the reflection of 100 unmoving faces as Olivia Carter stood frozen beside the grand staircase, one hand instinctively resting on her 7-month pregnant belly, her breath shallow, controlled, almost too quiet for someone whose entire world had just shifted in a single second, and yet what no one in that room understood, not the guests in their tailored tuxedos, not the woman in the silver dress watching with a faint, satisfied smile, and certainly not Ethan Caldwell, the billionaire host of the night, was that this moment was not the end of Olivia's story. It was the exact second it began to turn. This is the story of how a woman everyone underestimated walked into a room owned by power and walked out owning something far greater. But to understand why that moment mattered, you have to see what everyone else missed. Because while the room held its breath, Olivia did something almost invisible. She didn't react. She didn't argue. She didn't even look at Ethan. Instead, her fingers tightened just slightly against the soft fabric of her dress, grounding herself, anchoring to something deeper than humiliation, deeper than shock. And in that silence, something shifted, something cold and precise began to take shape behind her calm expression. 3 years earlier, Olivia Carter had been the kind of woman people described as gentle, the kind who smiled more than she spoke, who believed in building a life quietly, rather than conquering one loudly. And when she met Ethan Caldwell, a man whose name opened doors and closed deals with equal force, she thought she had found stability, protection, a future carved in certainty. But what she didn't see then, what she couldn't have seen, was that power without accountability has a way of rewriting promises. And over time, the late nights turned into absences, the absences turned into distance, and the distance turned into something colder, something transactional, something that left her standing alone in rooms that once felt like home. The guests tonight didn't know that story. They didn't know about the dinners eaten alone, the calls unanswered, the quiet realization that love had been replaced with convenience. And they certainly didn't know about the message Olivia had received just 48 hours earlier, a message that had arrived without warning, without explanation, containing nothing but a single file and a name she hadn't seen in years, a name that made her hands tremble not with fear, but with recognition. Across the room, Ethan adjusted his cufflinks with the same effortless confidence that had built his empire, his expression unreadable, as if moments like this were simply inconveniences to be managed, narratives to be controlled. But control, Olivia would soon learn, is only as strong as the truths it hides. And tonight, those truths were closer to the surface than anyone realized. The woman in silver, the one who had been lingering just a step too close, smiling just a second too long, shifted her weight slightly, her presence subtle but intentional, a silent claim, a quiet declaration that the lines had already been crossed long before tonight. And still, Olivia didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge the tension that everyone else could feel tightening like a wire stretched too thin, because Olivia's focus had already moved somewhere else entirely, somewhere beyond the room, beyond the whispers, beyond the carefully constructed image Ethan had spent years protecting. The air felt heavier now, the kind of stillness that settles right before something changes. And though no one could see it yet, Olivia Carter was no longer standing in that room as the woman they thought they knew. She was standing there as someone who had already seen what was coming next, someone who understood that power doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in patience, in the decision not to react when everyone expects you to break. And as the seconds stretched just a little too long, as the room waited for her to say something, to do something, Olivia simply lifted her gaze, not toward Ethan, not toward the woman beside him, but toward the far end of the room, where a single detail, almost invisible to everyone else, confirmed what she had suspected all along. And in that moment, without a single word, the balance of the entire night began to shift. The first person to notice it was not Ethan, and it was not the woman in silver. It was a man standing near the back of the room holding a glass he had not touched for the past 10 minutes. His eyes fixed not on Olivia, but on the direction of her gaze, because where she was looking was not random. It was precise, deliberate, and almost invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for, and Olivia knew. She had memorized that corner of the room the moment she stepped inside, the placement of the cameras, the angle of the lighting, the reflection in the polished marble floor that revealed more than what could be seen directly. And in that reflection she saw it again, the same detail that had been captured in the file she received 2 days ago, the same detail that had kept her awake through the night, not with fear, but with clarity. 48 hours earlier, Olivia had been sitting alone at her kitchen table, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound in an apartment that had grown too large for one person, her phone lighting up with a notification from an unknown sender. No name, no explanation, just a file and a single line that read, "You deserve to know the truth." And for a long moment she had not opened it, not because she was afraid of what it might contain, but because some part of her already understood that whatever was inside would change everything. And when she finally tapped the screen, when the video began to play, she did not cry, she did not react, she simply watched, her expression still, her breathing steady, as pieces of a reality she had been trying to ignore quietly arranged themselves into something undeniable. Back in the present, the room had started to move again, conversations returning in low, cautious tones, the kind people use when they sense something has happened but are not yet sure how to interpret it. And Ethan finally turned his attention fully toward Olivia, his voice calm, measured, controlled in the way of a man who believed he could still guide the outcome of any situation. "Olivia," he said, as if her name alone could reset the moment, as if speaking gently now could erase everything that had led to this. But Olivia did not answer immediately. Instead, she shifted her weight slightly, one hand still resting over her belly, feeling the subtle movement beneath her palm, a reminder that she was not alone in this, that every decision she made now carried weight beyond herself. Across from her, the woman in silver let out a soft breath that might have been a laugh if it had lasted a second longer, her confidence returning as the silence stretched, because in her mind this was already over. Olivia was supposed to fold, to step back, to accept what had been quietly decided without her. And for years that might have been true. Olivia might have chosen peace over confrontation, silence over disruption. But something had shifted long before tonight. Something that began the moment she pressed play on that video and realized that the story she had been living was not the full story at all. Ethan took a step closer now, lowering his voice as if to create a private space in the middle of a very public room. "We can talk about this later," he said, each word carefully chosen, each syllable carrying the expectation of compliance. But Olivia finally lifted her eyes to meet his, and for the first time that evening there was no hesitation in her expression, no uncertainty, only a calm that did not belong to the woman he thought he knew. And it was that calm, more than anything else, that caused something unfamiliar to flicker across his face. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. Something that suggested he was beginning to understand that control was no longer entirely his. Olivia inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that signals a decision rather than a reaction. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet, steady, and unmistakably clear. "Not later," she said, and though the words were simple, the effect was immediate. Conversation stopped again, attention shifted back toward them. And in that moment, Olivia Carter was no longer the woman standing at the edge of someone else's world. She was the center of it, not because she demanded attention, but because she refused to disappear. And somewhere near the back of the room, the man who had been watching set his glass down for the first time, as if preparing for something he already knew was about to happen. Because the truth, once it begins to surface, does not stop halfway. The word hung in the air longer than it should have. Not later, simple, controlled, but it carried a weight that shifted something invisible inside the room. And for a brief second no one moved. No one spoke. Because people recognize moments like that even if they do not understand them. Moments when a line has been quietly crossed, and there is no returning to what things were just seconds before. Ethan exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening just enough to reveal the effort it took to maintain composure. And though his posture remained confident, there was a subtle change in the way he held himself, a recalibration, as if he were adjusting to variables he had not anticipated. "Olivia," he repeated, softer this time. But the tone had changed, less directive, more cautious, because he was beginning to realize that this conversation was no longer following the script he had relied on for years. Olivia took a single step forward, Not dramatic, not confrontational, but deliberate, closing. The distance just enough to make it impossible for him to pretend this could be handled quietly later, her voice steady as she spoke again. I think it is better if we are all clear now. And though she did not raise her volume, the clarity of her words carried across the room with unexpected precision, drawing attention without demanding it. The woman in silver shifted again, her confidence flickering for the first time, not disappearing, but adjusting, recalculating in the same way Ethan had. Because there was something in Olivia's tone that did not match the role she had been assigned, something that suggested she knew more than she was supposed to know. Ethan let out a small, controlled breath, glancing briefly toward the surrounding guests before returning his focus to Olivia. You are tired, he said carefully, choosing a narrative he could still manage. You should not be standing this long. We can continue this conversation at home. But Olivia's expression did not change, and for a moment it felt as if his words had not reached her at all, as if she were already operating on a different level of awareness entirely. 2 days earlier, after watching the video for the third time, Olivia had not reacted immediately. She had not called anyone, had not confronted Ethan. Instead, she opened her laptop and began searching, quietly, methodically, following details most people would have overlooked: timestamps, locations, reflections in glass, surfaces, small inconsistencies that did not belong. And piece by piece, a larger picture began to form, one that extended beyond a single moment, beyond a single person, a pattern that suggested intention rather than accident. And the more she saw, the clearer it became that silence would no longer protect her, it would only protect him. Back in the present, Olivia reached into her small clutch, the movement slow, unhurried, and for a fraction of a second Ethan's eyes followed it, instinctively, as if he sensed that whatever came next would not be something he could easily dismiss. She did not take anything out immediately. Instead, she let her hand rest there, grounding herself again, reminding herself that this was not about anger, not about reaction. It was about truth, and truth required precision. The man near the back of the room straightened slightly, his attention sharpening, because he recognized the shift before anyone else did, the transition from uncertainty to intent. And across the polished floor, the reflection revealed it clearly. Olivia was no longer standing defensively. She was standing with purpose. Ethan took another step closer, lowering his voice further, enough that only those nearest could hear. You are making this more difficult than it needs to be, he said. And though the words were calm, there was an edge beneath them now, a subtle pressure. But Olivia finally shook her head, a small movement, almost gentle, and when she spoke again, her voice carried not defiance but certainty. It was already difficult, she said. I just did not have the full picture before, and something in the way she said it caused the room to tighten again, because people do not use words like that unless they are about to reveal something others are not prepared to hear. For the first time that evening, the woman in silver did not smile, her gaze narrowing slightly as she looked between them, trying to read a situation that was slipping just out of her control. And Ethan, for all his experience, for all his confidence, could not immediately respond. Because in that moment he understood something simple but dangerous. Olivia was not reacting anymore. She was leading. And the direction she was leading toward was no longer his to control. The shift was almost imperceptible, but it was there, like a change in pressure before a storm. And for those paying attention, it was enough to understand that whatever came next would not be contained. Olivia's fingers finally moved inside her clutch, not rushed, not hesitant, just precise. And when she withdrew her hand, it was not empty. A slim phone rested between her fingers, its screen dark for now, unassuming, ordinary, and yet somehow it drew more attention than anything else in the room, because of the way she held it, not like a distraction, not like a shield, but like a decision that had already been made. Ethan's eyes dropped to it for a fraction of a second before returning to her face, and in that brief glance something flickered, not recognition exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes when a situation begins to move beyond expectation. Olivia, he said again, quieter now, controlled, but there was a tension beneath it that had not been there before. Whatever you think you saw, whatever you think you know, this is not the place for it. But Olivia did not respond immediately. Instead, she let the silence stretch just long enough for his words to settle and unravel on their own, because she understood something he did not. Timing was no longer his advantage. 2 nights ago, after the video had ended, Olivia had not closed it. She had replayed it, slowing it down frame by frame, noticing things that would escape anyone watching casually. The reflection of a watch face, the alignment of a glass panel, the timestamp that did not match the official schedule she had been told, and then she had cross-checked, pulling records, comparing details, and what began as a single moment had expanded into a sequence, a pattern that connected more than just people. It connected decisions, choices made quietly, deliberately, under the assumption that no one would ever look closely enough to see them. Back in the present, Olivia lifted the phone slightly, not high enough to display, just enough to signal that it was no longer hidden, and when she finally spoke, her voice was even, almost calm in a way that made people lean in without realizing it. "I did not come here to make a scene," she said, and for a second that seemed to reassure some of the listeners. But then she continued, "I came because I was invited, and because I was given something that I could not ignore," and that second part landed differently, heavier, because it introduced something new into the room, something external, something beyond the immediate tension. The woman in silver stiffened almost imperceptibly, her gaze sharpening as she studied the phone now with more intent, as if trying to determine whether it was relevant to her or not. While Ethan's posture remained steady, but the stillness had changed. It was no longer confidence. It was calculation, a rapid internal process of assessing risk, exposure, and control. Near the back, the man who had been watching took a step forward, not enough to draw attention, just enough to close the distance. His expression focused now, because he recognized the structure of moments like this, the quiet build before something irreversible. Olivia's thumb moved across the screen, waking it, a soft glow illuminating her face for just a second, reflecting in her eyes. And in that reflection, there was no hesitation, no doubt, only clarity. She did not raise the phone yet, did not reveal what was on it. Instead, she held it at her side again, as if reminding everyone that what mattered was not the object itself, but what it represented. Ethan exhaled slowly, and this time the control in his voice felt more deliberate, more forced. "Olivia, you are misunderstanding something," he said, and though the words were carefully chosen, they carried less certainty than before. Because misunderstanding implies confusion, and there was nothing in Olivia's expression that suggested she was confused anymore. She shook her head once, gently, almost sympathetically, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet finality that cut through the room more effectively than any raised tone could have. "No," she said. "I think for the first time I understand everything." And the way she said everything made it clear that this was no longer about a single moment. It was about a series of truths that had been hidden in plain sight. And as the silence returned, thicker now, more expectant, one thing became undeniable to everyone in that room. Whatever was on that phone was not a question, it was an answer, and it was about to change who held the power in a way none of them had prepared for. The room did not erupt. It did something far more dangerous. It leaned in, because people sense when the truth is about to surface, and they do not look away from that. They watch, quietly, carefully, as if proximity alone might reveal something they were not meant to see. And Olivia understood that better than anyone standing there, which was why she did not rush. She did not raise her voice. She simply let the silence expand until it belonged to her. Her thumb moved again, this time more deliberate, and the faint glow of the screen returned, casting a soft reflection across the polished floor beneath her, a reflection that mirrored more than just light. It mirrored intention, because this was no longer about reacting to what had been done. It was about choosing what would be revealed next. Ethan's gaze sharpened now, his attention fixed fully on the device in her hand, and though he did not step back, though he did not show anything that could be clearly defined as fear, there was a shift in the way he stood, less relaxed, more anchored, as if bracing for something he could not yet identify. "Olivia," he said again, his voice lower, more contained. "Whatever this is, we can handle it privately." And the word privately hung in the air with more weight than he intended, because it exposed the one thing he still hoped to control, the audience. Olivia let out a slow breath, steady, measured, and for a moment her eyes moved away from him, not toward the woman in silver, not toward the guests who were now openly watching, but toward that same far corner of the room where the reflection had first revealed what she needed to see. And in that direction, almost unnoticed, someone gave the slightest nod, not dramatic, not obvious, just enough to confirm that she was not standing alone in this moment. And that confirmation settled something inside her that had been waiting, not for courage, but for certainty. 2 nights earlier, after hours of reviewing the footage, Olivia had reached a point where questions were no longer useful, where doubt had been replaced by clarity, and that was when she made the decision that changed everything. She did not call Ethan. She did not confront him. She reached out to the number attached to the file, a number she had almost ignored. And when the voice on the other end answered, calm, direct, already aware of who she was, Olivia realized that the truth she had uncovered was not isolated. It was part of something larger, something that extended beyond her marriage, beyond a single betrayal, and into a pattern that someone else had been tracking long before she knew it existed. Back in the present, Olivia lifted the phone slightly higher, not enough to display the screen to everyone, but enough that Ethan could no longer pretend it was irrelevant. And when she spoke again, her voice carried that same quiet precision that had guided her every step since she opened that file. You are right about one thing, she said, her tone almost thoughtful. This could have been handled privately. And for a brief second Ethan's expression shifted, a flicker of something that might have been relief, because he heard possibility in those words. But then she continued, and the possibility disappeared just as quickly. It stopped being private when I realized I was not the only one being misled, and that sentence changed the room entirely. Because it expanded the scope, it turned a personal issue into something broader, something that could involve more than just the people standing in front of her, the woman in silver. Straightened now, her composure tightening, because this was no longer a situation she could dismiss as emotional or temporary. There was structure to Olivia's words, direction, and that made them dangerous in a way she had not anticipated. Near the back, the man who had been watching took another small step forward, his presence still subtle, but now undeniably connected to the moment, as if the distance between observer and participant had quietly disappeared. Ethan's voice came again, but this time it carried a sharper edge beneath the calm. You are overthinking this, he said, a statement designed to reduce, to minimize, to regain ground. But Olivia shook her head once more, and this time there was no softness in the gesture, only finality. No, she said. I spent a long time not thinking enough, and that was the mistake. And as the words settled, she turned the phone in her hand just slightly, angling it toward him, not yet revealing everything, but enough for him to see a single, frozen frame, a detail unmistakable, a moment he recognized instantly even if no one else could yet understand its significance. And in that instant, something in his expression broke, not completely, not visibly to everyone, but enough for those paying attention to know that whatever control he believed he still had was no longer absolute. And Olivia, standing there calm and unmoved, understood that the next move would not just change the night, it would define everything that came after. For a fraction of a second, time fractured into something thin and fragile, because Ethan Caldwell had seen enough in that single frozen frame to understand what Olivia was holding. Not the full truth, not the entire scope, but enough to recognize the origin, the place, the moment that was never supposed to exist outside of controlled memory. And that realization did not show in a dramatic reaction. It showed in restraint, in the way his shoulders held just a little too still, in the way his next breath came slower than the last, as if calculating had suddenly become more important than speaking. Olivia watched it happen, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with clarity, because this was the confirmation she needed, the silent admission that required no words. And once you see that shift in someone, once you recognize that their confidence is no longer instinctive but constructed, you understand exactly where the power has moved. The guests did not know what they were seeing, not fully, but they felt it, the subtle change in atmosphere, the tension that no longer belonged to speculation but to something real, something forming just beneath the surface, and people adjusted without realizing it. Conversation stopped entirely now. Glasses remained untouched, attention sharpened, because instinct tells you when you are standing at the edge of a moment that will be talked about long after it ends. Olivia lowered the phone slightly again, not hiding it, just controlling its presence, because she understood something else Ethan did not. Revelation is not about speed, it is about sequence, and she had already planned the order in which things would unfold 2 nights earlier. After that phone call ended, Olivia had not slept, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she was preparing, organizing what she had into something structured, something that could not be dismissed or reframed, and more importantly, something that could not be contained once it was introduced. She had met the man who had been watching from the back of the room, not here, not in public, but in a quiet office 3 miles away, where documents had been laid out in front of her, timelines aligned, details confirmed. And for the first time she understood that what she had thought was a private betrayal was connected to decisions that affected far more than her own life. Back in the present, Ethan's voice came again. But now there was no attempt to soften it, no effort to disguise the urgency beneath it. "Olivia," he said, low enough that it did not carry, but sharp enough that those closest could feel it. "You do not understand the implications of what you are doing," and that sentence revealed more than he intended, because implications suggest consequences beyond embarrassment, beyond reputation. They suggest something larger, something that could not be resolved with a simple explanation. Olivia tilted her head slightly, considering him for a moment as if weighing not his words but the intention behind them. And when she spoke again her voice remained steady, but there was something new beneath it now, not just certainty, but resolve. "I understand more than you think," she said, and then, after a brief pause that seemed to stretch longer than it should have, "I understand enough to know that this is not just about us," and the word "us" no longer sounded personal. It sounded like a category, something she had already stepped outside of. The woman in silver shifted again, this time unable to mask it completely, her composure tightening into something sharper, because she could feel the direction of the moment changing, and she did not like not knowing where it would end. Near the back, the man who had been watching finally moved into clearer view, not rushing, not interrupting, just positioning himself where he could no longer be mistaken for a bystander. And though he said nothing, his presence alone altered the equation, because it confirmed what Olivia had already implied, that this situation extended beyond a private conversation. Ethan noticed him immediately, his eyes narrowing just slightly, recognition flickering across his expression in a way that only someone watching closely would catch, and that recognition carried something heavier than surprise. It carried understanding, the kind that arrives too late to prevent what is coming. Olivia followed his gaze for a brief second, just enough to acknowledge the connection, and then returned her attention to Ethan, her grip on the phone steady, her posture unchanged, because the moment had moved past hesitation, past uncertainty, into something final, something irreversible. And when she spoke again her voice did not rise, it did not demand attention, it simply carried it. "I gave you every chance to tell the truth," she said quietly, and though no one in the room knew exactly what truth she meant, they understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever came next would not be something that could be undone. And for the first time that evening, Ethan Caldwell did not respond immediately, because in that silence, he was no longer controlling the narrative, he was reacting to it. The silence did not break, it deepened, like the room itself was holding something back, waiting for the exact second when restraint would no longer be possible. And Olivia understood that moment had arrived, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with precision, her thumb moving once more across the screen, not hesitating now, not pausing, just completing what had already been decided long before she stepped into that room. The phone lifted slightly higher, just enough, and then it happened. Not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The screen turned outward, angled so that it was no longer meant for Ethan alone. And for the first time that evening, the truth was no longer contained between two people. It became visible, shared, impossible to ignore. At first, there was confusion, because people do not immediately understand what they are seeing when they are not prepared for it. But confusion lasts only a second when clarity follows, and what followed was recognition, subtle at first, then spreading, as those closest leaned in, as reflections carried the image further than the screen itself, as pieces began to connect in the minds of those who had been paying attention not just to this moment, but to everything leading up to it. Ethan did not move, not immediately, and that stillness spoke louder than any reaction could have. Because when someone who is used to controlling every outcome chooses not to respond, it is not because there is nothing to say. It is because they are searching for something that no longer exists, a version of the situation they can still manage. Olivia did not explain. She did not narrate. She allowed the image to exist on its own, because truth does not require embellishment when it is presented at the right moment, and she had waited for that moment, built toward it, ensured that it could not be dismissed as misunderstanding or misinterpretation. The woman in silver took a small step back, almost imperceptible, but it was there, the first physical sign that confidence had shifted into uncertainty, her gaze fixed on the screen now, no longer evaluating Olivia, no longer calculating her next move, but trying to understand what she had not anticipated. Near the back, the man who had stepped forward earlier stopped completely, his posture straight, his attention unwavering, because this was the point where observation ended and consequence began. 2 nights earlier, in that quiet office, Olivia had asked one question after everything had been laid out in front of her: what happens next? And the answer she received had not been complicated. It had not been emotional. It had been simple. It depends on what you choose to do with the truth. And in that moment she had understood that the power was never in the information itself. It was in the timing, the context, the decision to reveal it when it could no longer be controlled by anyone else. Back in the present, Ethan finally moved, not stepping back, not reaching for the phone, just a subtle shift of weight, a recalibration that came too late to change anything. His voice when it came was controlled, but the certainty that had defined it earlier was gone. "You are making a mistake," he said, and the words sounded different now, not like a warning, but like an attempt to recover ground that had already disappeared. Olivia lowered the phone slightly, not hiding it, just ending the display, because she did not need to hold it there any longer. The moment had already done its work, and when she spoke again her voice was calm, almost quiet, but it carried across the room with unmistakable clarity. "No," she said. "The mistake was thinking I would never see it." And that sentence settled into the room with a weight that could not be redirected, because it was not an accusation, it was a conclusion. The guests did not speak, not because they were unsure, but because they understood that they were witnessing something that did not belong to them, something that had already reached its turning point, and in that understanding there was a kind of stillness that comes only when the outcome is no longer in question. Olivia's hand returned to rest gently over her belly, grounding herself once more, not in fear, not in uncertainty, but in something steadier, something that had been building quietly beneath everything else. And as she looked at Ethan now, there was no anger in her expression, no demand, only recognition, the kind that comes when you finally see someone clearly after years of believing something else. And in that clarity, there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to protect, only the next step, the one that would carry everything forward from this exact point, where the truth had already been seen and could never be unseen. No one applauded, no one spoke, and somehow that silence carried more weight than any reaction ever could, because when a truth lands exactly where it is meant to, it does not need noise to prove its impact. It reshapes the space around it. And Olivia could feel that shift as clearly as if it had been announced out loud. Ethan remained where he stood, but the stillness that once looked like control now looked different. It looked like containment, like someone holding together pieces that were beginning to move in directions he could no longer predict. His gaze no longer searching for an angle, no longer calculating the next line, but fixed, grounded in the realization that whatever narrative he had built no longer belonged to him. The woman in silver no longer tried to hide her reaction. Her posture tightened, her confidence no longer effortless but deliberate, as if she were choosing each movement carefully now, aware that she was no longer invisible in this story, that the edges of what had been revealed might reach further than she expected. Olivia did not look at her, not because she was ignoring her, but because she no longer needed to. The center of gravity had shifted completely, and everything else was now orbiting around something larger than personal rivalry or quiet assumptions. Near the back, the man who had stepped forward earlier finally closed the remaining distance, not rushing, not interrupting, just arriving, his presence calm but undeniable, and when He stopped just a few feet away from Olivia. The subtle alignment between them became clear to anyone paying attention. Not dramatic, not declared, but understood, as if a line that had been invisible before was now fully drawn. Ethan's eyes moved to him again, and this time the recognition did not flicker. It settled, heavy, complete, and with it came the understanding that this moment had been building long before tonight, that Olivia had not walked into this unprepared, and that what stood in front of him was not a reaction, but a sequence already in motion. Olivia exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that marks transition rather than hesitation, and when she spoke again her voice was steady, not raised, not sharpened, but carrying a clarity that made every word land exactly where it was meant to. "I did not want it to happen like this," she said, and there was no accusation in her tone, only truth. "I gave you time, I gave you space, I gave you every chance to choose honesty." And for a moment it almost sounded like something softer, something reflective, but then she paused, just long enough for the weight of what she was saying to settle, and then she continued, "But silence is also a choice, and so is what comes after it." The room held that sentence differently, because it was no longer about what had been done. It was about responsibility, about the decisions that follow when truth is no longer hidden. Ethan's voice came again, but this time it was quieter, less controlled, not because he lacked composure, but because he understood that volume no longer mattered. "Olivia, we can still fix this," he said, and for the first time, the words did not sound like authority. They sounded like negotiation, like an attempt to regain something that had already slipped beyond reach. Olivia looked at him fully now, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with something far more final, recognition without attachment, and she shook her head once, slowly, not dismissing him, but acknowledging what had already become irreversible. "Some things are not meant to be fixed," she said softly, and the softness of her tone only made the certainty behind it stronger. The man beside her did not speak. He did not need to. His presence alone reinforced what had already been revealed, that this moment was not isolated, that it carried consequences beyond the walls of this room, beyond the people gathered here. The guests shifted slightly now, not stepping away, but adjusting to a reality that had changed without warning, because they understood that they were no longer watching a private disagreement. They were witnessing the collapse of something that had been carefully constructed over time. Olivia's hand rested again over her belly, steady, grounded, and in that gesture there was something quiet but powerful, a reminder that her decisions were no longer shaped by what she had been willing to endure, but by what she refused to accept moving forward. And as the silence settled once more, deeper than before, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer about what had been hidden. It was about what would happen now that everything had been brought into the light. And in that space, where nothing could be undone, Olivia Carter stood not as someone who had lost control, but as someone who had finally taken it back without ever needing to raise her voice. Nothing dramatic followed, and that was what made it final. There was no raised voice, no sudden movement, no desperate attempt to reclaim what had already slipped away, because everyone in that room understood something at the same time. This moment had already passed its point of reversal. Ethan stood there, still composed on the surface, but the structure behind that composure had shifted, not collapsed, not visibly broken, but altered in a way that could not be undone, because control, once exposed, never returns in the same form, and he knew it, even if he did not show it. Olivia did not wait for another response, did not look for acknowledgement, because she was no longer standing there to be heard. She had already said everything that needed to be said, and more importantly, she had shown what could not be argued against, and that difference between words and proof was what separated this moment from every conversation that had come before it. The man beside her finally spoke, his voice calm, professional, carrying just enough to reach those closest without turning the room into a stage. "We will be following up formally," he said, not looking at the guests, not addressing the room, but directing his words with quiet precision. And though he did not explain further, he did not need to, because the implication was clear. What had begun here would not end here. It would continue, structured, documented, impossible to contain. The woman in silver lowered her gaze for the first time, not in defeat, but in recognition. The kind that comes when a situation moves beyond personal control, when it becomes part of something larger, something that does not respond to charm or confidence or proximity. And in that realization, her presence in the room changed, no longer central, no longer influential, just one piece in a much larger sequence unfolding around her. The guests shifted subtly, some stepping back, others remaining still, all of them aware that they were no longer participants in a social evening, but witnesses to a turning point. And that awareness carried a quiet respect, not for the spectacle, but for the precision with which it had been executed. Olivia adjusted her posture slightly, not out of discomfort, but out of completion, her hand resting once more over her belly, steady, grounded. And in that simple gesture, there was something more powerful than anything that had been said, because it was not about what she had revealed, it was about what she was choosing moving forward. She looked at Ethan one last time, not searching for a reaction, not expecting a response, just seeing him clearly, without assumption, without hope, without the weight of what had once been attached to his presence. And in that clarity, there was no anger left, only distance. He opened his mouth slightly, as if to speak again, but whatever words he had prepared did not arrive, because for the first time that evening, he understood something fundamental. This was not a conversation he could redirect, not a situation he could negotiate. It was an outcome he had already shaped through choices made long before tonight, and now those choices had reached him in a form he could not control. Olivia turned away first, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a simple movement that carried more meaning than anything else that had happened, because it marked the end of her involvement in this moment. Not the end of the consequences, not the end of what would follow, but the end of her standing still inside something that no longer defined her. The man beside her moved with her, not leading, not guiding, simply accompanying, as they walked toward the exit, their pace unhurried, their presence steady, leaving behind a room that had not yet found its voice again. Behind them, the silence remained, not empty, but full of realization, full of the understanding that what had just happened was not about exposure alone. It was about accountability, about the quiet but irreversible shift that occurs when truth is no longer hidden. And as Olivia stepped through the doors and into the cooler air beyond, the noise of the world returning gradually around her, she did not look back, because she did not need to. The past had already said everything it could, and what remained was something far more important, the space ahead, where decisions would no longer be shaped by silence, but by the simple, unshakable understanding that dignity, once reclaimed, does not ask for permission to remain.